The service manager at Ridgecroft Auto closed the folder without looking up. "Mr. Callahan," he said, and the way he said it, flat, almost apologetic, told Lena everything before he finished the sentence. "Our diagnostic team has reviewed the vehicle 3 times. The transfer case is seized, the transmission's showing multiple fault codes we can't clear. At this point, we'd be doing you a disservice if we told you anything other than what we're telling you now." He finally looked up. "It's not worth repairing." Lena Callahan stood across the counter in her wool coat, her hands folded in front of her, and she did not cry. She had learned in the past 2 years how to receive bad news without crying in front of strangers. She had gotten very good at it. "How much would the repairs cost," she asked, "if you did them?" He hesitated. "Conservatively, between 18 and 22,000, and that's with no guarantee the underlying electrical issue wouldn't resurface, and the truck is worth maybe 9, maybe 10 in good condition, which it isn't presently." She nodded once. She thanked him. She walked out to the parking lot where the truck sat on the far end, a 1994 Dodge Ram that had belonged to her father, and she stood beside it in the November cold for a long moment before she got in. The truck had been her father's. He had driven it for 19 years. He had taught her how to drive in it, in the gravel lot behind the hockey arena in Cochrane when she was 14, and she had steered in wide, terrified arcs while he laughed from the passenger seat with his arm out the window even though it was October. When he passed 16 months ago, she had not been able to give the truck away. She had not been able to do much of anything with it. And then one morning in early October, it simply would not start, and the week that followed had taken her to 3 dealerships, 2 independent shops, and now here, Ridgecroft, the largest GM service center in this part of Ontario, where a man in a Ridgecroft polo shirt had just told her that her father's truck was not worth keeping. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at her hands. Her brother-in-law, who lived in Guelph and had opinions about everything, had already told her to sell it. He'd said it twice at Thanksgiving, between mouthfuls of stuffing, in that reasonable voice she had come to associate with people who had never loved something that rusted. Her daughter, Fiona, who was 8, had not said anything about the truck at all. But Fiona had cried quietly in the back seat on the drive home from the 3rd dealership, and she had pretended to be asleep when they pulled into the driveway, and Lena had pretended not to notice. She drove the truck home on borrowed time. The service manager at Ridgecroft had told her it was drivable, just barely if she kept it under 80. She found the name by accident. Her colleague at the school board office, a woman named Bev, who kept a photo of her cat on her monitor and remembered everything, had mentioned it in passing. "There's a place out on Havelock Road," Bev said, not looking up from her keyboard. "Past the gravel pit. My husband took the Subaru there once when everywhere else told him to scrap it. The guy fixed it for $400, didn't even charge for the diagnostic." "What's his name?" Lena asked. Bev squinted. "Garrett? No, that's not right. Graham? Something with a G." She typed something, frowned, gave up. "The place is just called Cutter Road Automotive. You'll see the sign. It's a bit rough looking, but don't let that stop you." Lena looked it up that evening. There was no website. There was a listing on a local directory site with an address, a phone number, and a single review from 2019 that said only, "Did what he said he would. Truck runs perfect. No name, no hours, no photos." She called the number the next morning from the school board parking lot before she went in. A man answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was unhurried, slightly rough, the voice of someone who had been awake for a while already. "Cutter Road," he said. "Hi," Lena said. I was given your name or your address, I suppose. I have a 94 Ram that 3 shops have told me is done. I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a look at it." A pause. Not uncomfortable, more like someone thinking before speaking, which had become unusual enough that she noticed it. "What are they saying is wrong with it?" "Transfer case and transmission. Multiple fault codes. One place told me the transfer case was seized. Another said it was the transmission harness. The third said both." Another pause. And what does it sound like to you when you start it? She blinked. No one had asked her that. It doesn't start. It clicks. One click, like something's trying and giving up right away. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, you can bring it in Thursday if you want. I can't promise anything, but I'll have a look. What's your name? She asked. Voss, he said. Owen? No, sorry, James. James Voss. She almost smiled. That bad of a morning? My daughter wanted pancakes, he said. We didn't have eggs. James Voss had been a licensed mechanic for 22 years, though he would have told you that the license was the least important part of that sentence. He had grown up in Timmins, the son of a man who fixed snowmobiles and lawnmowers and the occasional school bus for whatever people could pay, which was sometimes money and sometimes a case of beer, and once, memorably, a set of used hockey skates that didn't fit anyone in the family, but which his father had hung on a nail in the garage because he liked the way they looked. James had learned to read an engine the way some people learn to read faces, by watching, by listening, by understanding that what a thing said on the surface was almost never the whole story. He had worked at a dealer in Sudbury for 6 years. He had been good at it, better than good, and he had been passed over for the lead technician position twice. Once for a man with less experience and a better handshake, once for a man with less experience and a cousin on the ownership board. He had not been bitter about it, exactly. He had been clarified. He understood then what he had probably known for a while, that he worked better without a ceiling. He had opened Cutter Road Automotive 11 years ago with a leased bay, a used lift, and more debt than he liked to think about. He had paid it off in 6 years. He had not advertised once. He had a core of about 40 customers who returned reliably and sent him their neighbors, and that was enough, not lavish, but enough. His daughter, Maeve, was 9 now. She came with him on school holidays and sat on an overturned bucket near the office doorway, and read or drew or, increasingly, watched what he was doing with an attention that sometimes stopped him mid-task. His wife, Pauline, had died of an aneurysm 4 years ago on a Tuesday morning in March while she was making coffee. She had been 38. James had been in the garage when it happened, 40 minutes away, and by the time he got to the hospital there was nothing. Just a room and a doctor and a kind of silence he had never encountered before and had not been able to fully leave since. He did not talk about it much, Maeve knew. Maeve was the only person he needed to know. When Lena Callahan pulled the Dodge into the yard on Thursday morning, James was finishing up a brake job on a Tacoma. He wiped his hands on a cloth and came out to meet her. She was about 40, he guessed. Dark hair, the kind of composed that takes some practice to maintain. The truck idled roughly and then died when she turned the key. "One click?" he said. "One click," she said. He walked around the truck slowly. He crouched at the front and looked under the front end without touching anything. He stood and looked at the cab. He put his hand on the hood, not to open it, just rested it there for a moment, which she thought was strange, and then she thought maybe it wasn't. "How long did your dad have it?" he said. She looked at him. "I didn't say it was my dad's." He looked at the mirror adjustment knob, the way the seat was positioned, the small worn cross hanging from the rear view. That was the only thing in the truck that might have been hers. "Guessing," he said. 19 years. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He popped the hood. James had learned something, early in his career, that most shops seemed to systematically unlearn, that a diagnostic system told you where the codes were, not where the problem was. The two were related but not the same, and confusing them was the source of most of the expensive mistakes he saw come through his door, wearing the receipts of somewhere else's work. The Ram's diagnostic codes pointed at the transmission and the transfer case. 3 separate shops had read those codes and done what the codes told them to do, which was conclude that the transmission and the transfer case were the problem. He did not dismiss that possibility. He logged the codes, wrote them down in the small notebook he kept on the shelf above the driver's side wheel well, and then he set them aside. He listened. The click on startup was specific. Single solenoid click, clean engagement, then nothing. Not the transmission trying, Not the transfer case. Something earlier in the chain. Something that was reading incorrectly and killing the signal before it reached the drivetrain at all. He spent 40 minutes under the truck without saying anything. Lena had expected him to suggest she wait somewhere. There was a Tim Hortons about 3 kilometers down the road, but he hadn't, and so she sat on a wooden stool near the wall and watched. At some point, a child appeared in the doorway. A girl, 9 or 10, with James's same unhurried quality. She leaned against the doorframe and looked at the underside of the truck with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "Is that the ram?" the girl said. "That's the ram," James said from somewhere under the rear axle. "What's wrong with it?" "Still finding out." The girl looked at Lena. "He always says that," she said in a tone that contained no frustration, just information. "But then he finds it." "Maeve," James said. "Not a reprimand, just locating her." "I'm just saying," Maeve said, and retreated back into the doorway. He found it 40 minutes after that. He stood up slowly, the way men do when they've been folded in a small space for a while, and he went to his workbench and wrote something in his notebook. He looked at it. He looked at the truck. "The fault codes are real," he said. "The transmission is logging errors because the TCM is receiving a false signal. But the TCM isn't broken. The transmission isn't broken. The transfer case isn't seized." Lena waited. "There's a ground strap behind the firewall that's corroded through. Old truck, old wiring, it doesn't happen often, but it happens. The whole signal chain from the battery to the drivetrain is grounding intermittently, and when it drops out, the control modules read it as a system fault and shut down. Which is exactly what they're supposed to do. The truck is doing the right thing. It's just doing it because it's being told the wrong thing." She stared at him. "So it's not the transmission?" "No. And it's not the transfer case?" "No. There's some normal wear in both that's worth addressing over the next year or two, but neither of them is causing your problem." 3 shops, she said. 3 shops ran the diagnostic. The diagnostic told them what it was designed to tell them, and they went from there. He didn't say it with contempt. He said it like a man describing weather. "The ground strap is about 9 inches long and it's behind the firewall, which is not where anyone looks when the codes are pointing somewhere else. But it's where the problem is." She sat with that for a moment. "Can you fix it?" "I can fix it," he said. "If the wiring behind the firewall is in decent shape and doesn't need rerouting, you're looking at maybe 4 or 5 hours of labor and parts that'll cost you under $200. She thought she had misheard him. She asked him to repeat it. He did. He told her he'd call her by end of day Friday. She drove home in her own car. Bev from the school board had given her a lift, and she sat at the kitchen table that evening while Fiona did her homework and tried to understand what she was feeling, which turned out to be something close to embarrassed. Not at James Voss, or even at the other shops, but at herself for having been so close to accepting it, for having nearly let someone else's certainty replace her own uncertainty, as though certainty were proof of correctness. James had not used a scanner on the truck. She had noticed that. He had not plugged anything in, had not pulled up a screen. He had listened and looked and thought, and then he had found a 9-inch metal strap behind a firewall that 3 fully equipped automotive centers had missed. Fiona looked up from her worksheet. "Is Grandpa's truck going to be okay?" Lena looked at her daughter. "I think so," she said. "I really think so." Fiona looked at her for a moment, the way kids do when they're deciding whether to believe you, and then she nodded and went back to her worksheet. James called at 4:47 on Friday afternoon. "It's running," he said. "The wiring behind the firewall was in better shape than I expected. I replaced the ground strap, cleaned the terminals at both ends, rerouted a section of the harness that was sitting against the exhaust. That was a separate issue, not dangerous, but it would have caused problems eventually. Started right up. I've driven it twice around the block and idled it for 30 minutes. The codes are gone. The drivetrain's responding normally." She was in her car in the school board parking lot when he called, and she sat there after he finished and did not say anything for a moment. "You still there?" he said. Yes, she said. Sorry, yes. What do I owe you? I'll have the invoice ready when you pick it up. Parts were 168. Labor, I'm calling it 5 hours at my rate. She picked up the truck Saturday morning. Maeve was there again, sitting on the overturned bucket, reading a book with a horse on the cover. James handed Lena the invoice, and she looked at it and looked at him and said nothing, because everything she thought of saying felt either too much or not enough. The total, with parts and 5 hours of labor and tax, was $611. She wrote the check. Her hand was steady. She handed it to him and he folded it and put it in the breast pocket of his work shirt without looking at it. He drove it for 19 years, James said, not as a question. 19 years, she said. Good truck then. He thought so. James looked at the Ram sitting in the yard. The rear shocks are soft. You'll want to keep an eye on that. Other than that, it's in reasonable shape for the age. Just needs to be driven. She drove it home on a clear November morning with the heater running and both hands on the wheel. The truck moved the way she remembered it moving, solid, a little loud, with that particular vibration through the seat that she had stopped noticing when she was young and then missed. In the way, you miss things that were simply always there. She kept it under the speed limit the whole way. Not because she had to, because she wanted to. She told Bev on Monday, and Bev told the office, and by Wednesday 3 people had called Cutter Road Automotive asking about appointments. James had not changed his rate or his hours or anything about the way he worked. He took 2 of the 3. The third was a vehicle he didn't have the lift capacity for, and he said so plainly, and gave the caller the name of a shop in Barrie he trusted. He didn't post about it. He didn't ask anyone to leave a review. He went back to what he had been doing, which was the work. But something had happened, and it moved the way things move in small towns. Not loudly, but steadily, the way water finds its level. The story got told over coffee and at ACI practice and across back fences in the particular way that stories get told when people feel they have actually been handed something true. A woman on Dufferin Street called because her car's check engine light had been on for 4 months and 3 shops had quoted her a new catalytic converter. James diagnosed a faulty O2 sensor in 40 minutes. The repair cost her $230. A retired teacher in Cookstown brought in a Ford F-150 that a dealership had told him needed a new transfer case. James found a cracked vacuum line, 2 hours of labor. A man named Stuart Drummond. And this is important, because Stuart Drummond was not the kind of man who went looking for small garages on gravel roads, drove up from Barrie in the second week of December. He owned 3 manufacturing facilities and had a mechanic on retainer, and that mechanic had told him that the company's equipment transport truck needed a new transmission, and the quote was sitting on his desk at $37,000. He had heard about James Voss from a woman in a grocery store lineup who was telling someone else the story about a 1994 Dodge Ram. He stood in the yard and looked at the garage and looked at James and said, "I'm going to be honest with you. This is not what I expected." "That's fair," James said. "Can you look at it? What does it sound like when it shifts?" Stuart Drummond blinked. He hadn't expected to be asked that. He thought about it. "Kind of a thud," he said, "like something's catching." James nodded slowly. "Bring it in Tuesday." The problem with the transport truck was not the transmission. It was a shift fork inside the transmission. A single component, the kind of thing that requires patience and good hands to get to, that was bent slightly out of alignment and causing the transmission to hang between gears under load before dropping in with a thud. The transmission itself was structurally sound. The repair required pulling the unit, disassembling it to the midsection, replacing the shift fork and its related hardware, and reassembling. James did it in 2 days. Stuart Drummond's mechanic on retainer had run a standard load diagnostic, seen the transmission error codes, and quoted a new transmission. He was not incompetent. He had read what the machine told him to read. He had just not gone further. James had gone further, not because he was faster or smarter or better equipped, His equipment was older than anything in Stuart Drummond's corporate fleet. He went further because he did not stop at the code. He stopped at the problem. The invoice came to $4,200, including parts and 2 full days of labor. And one evening he had stayed late because Maeve was at her grandmother's in Barrie, and he had the time and he wanted the job done right. Stuart Drummond stood in the yard and looked at the number and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My guy quoted me 37,000. "I know," James said. "You told me. The truck runs fine now? Drive it out of the yard, you'll see." He did. He came back 10 minutes later and parked and got out and stood there. "Is there any chance you'd consider contract work?" he said. "For the facilities?" James looked at him. He looked at the garage. He looked at Maeve, who had come out of the back room and was standing in the doorway with her horsebook under her arm, watching. "I'd consider it," he said, "depending on what it involved. I'll have someone call you." "You can call me yourself," James said. "The number's the same one you used." December moved into January the way Ontario Decembers do, without announcement, without ceremony, just cold settling in until it was the only thing. Maeve went back to school. James kept his hours. The work did not transform overnight into something larger or louder than it had been. What it did was accumulate, the way trust accumulates quietly, in the record of things done correctly and simply told. Lena Callahan brought the Ram in for an oil change in the 3rd week of January. She had been meaning to since November, and she had let it go too long, and she felt faintly guilty about that in the way that felt connected to something else she couldn't quite name. James changed the oil, topped the washer fluid, checked the rear shocks, which had not gotten worse. She asked how Maeve was. "Reading everything she can get her hands on," he said. "We had to get a library card." "That sounds about right," Lena said. She paid. She was about to get in the truck when she stopped. "Those other shops," she said. "Did you? Was it frustrating to hear what they'd told me?" James thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, which was something she had noticed he did consistently before he answered anything. "Not frustrating," he said. "They read what they had. Most shops do. The system is built to read codes, so people read codes, and that works most of the time." He looked at the truck. "It just doesn't work when the code and the problem aren't the same thing, and the only way to know which situation you're in is to keep listening after the machine stops." She looked at him. "Your dad drove that truck for 19 years because it worked," he said. "It still works. It just needed someone to listen to what it was actually saying." She got in the truck. She sat there for a moment before she started it. She thought about her father teaching her to drive in the gravel lot in Cochrane, the wide arcs, his arm out the window in October, his laugh. She thought about the folder the Ridgecroft service manager had closed without looking up. She thought about a 9-inch ground strap behind a firewall, and how the whole story of a thing can live in the one place no one thought to look. She started the truck. It caught immediately, that solid, familiar sound that was nothing like silence. She pulled out of the yard at Cutter Road and onto the highway, and the November fields. January now, gray and flat and real, stretched out on both sides, and she drove her father's truck home in the ordinary brightness of a Canadian winter morning, and it ran exactly like it was supposed to.